Right, guys, we're going to talk about Lyndon Johnson, civil rights, and the Black Power movement. In August of 1963, this is where we have the famous March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. People were there to urge Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act, which they do in 1964. And this bans discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, as well as gender. The issues, though, when it came to blacks didn't just end, obviously, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And one of the big problems was the suppression of voting rights in the South that blacks had to go through. And a big part of that was the fact that, they would have these literacy tests. And these literacy tests, it wasn't, the idea behind it for, anyone, regardless of color, isn't the worst thing in the world saying, well, you should have to prove that you can read before you can go vote. The problem was that these were not meant to test if you could read. These were just to keep people from voting. They might ask somebody, how many county judges are there in their county, and then they say who it is or say how many they are, and then they would just keep making the questions harder. Well, name all the judges, and obviously, nobody's going to be able to do that, so they would prevent those individuals from being able to register to vote. So it prevents a lot of people from being able to vote. And part of it is they did not want African Americans to have influence. Many of these communities had a large number of African Americans that would have gotten into power, become mayors, sheriffs potentially, gotten on the Board of Education, and had a great deal of influence over their areas. And there were people that wanted to prevent that from happening, so they did. 50% of Mississippi was black, yet 1% of blacks voted in Mississippi. So clearly there's a problem. Now, to curb this, to try to change this, there is a group that organizes what became known as Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer was a movement and a goal to to register as many blacks to vote as they could in the South, to get people to vote. And these people that were going from town to town trying to get African Americans registered to vote, in a lot of cases they'd get to places and they'd be very untrusting. These were all white students that did this, and at one point 3 of the volunteers are eventually found dead, white students that were trying to help blacks register to vote. But the forces that didn't want to see that happen, did things, and they decided to take care of it on their own hands and use fear and intimidation. No juries convicted anyone that was accused of it. It's a real tragedy. And this leads Martin Luther King and others to march from Selma, where they were met with tear gas, whips, dogs, fire hoses. And these images go on television. And when these images go on television, people begin to be disgusted with how they were being treated simply for wanting the right to vote. If you see the movie Selma, this is what that's all about. Eventually, though, this leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this banned literacy tests and allowed federal officials to register voters. Now, we still have issues with voting registration. There's those that, particularly Republicans, they want to see people have to show ID in order to vote. Democrats are against that, and we're seeing a little bit of a tension, and Democrats accuse Republicans of wanting to suppress voting rights, and Republicans say you have to use ID to buy a pack of cigarettes, but not to vote. What's more important? So we have a lot of back and forth right now as a result. Now, there was a movement with Stokely Carmichael, who was a member of SNCC. He was part of that Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But after several of these incidents where people had violence brought against them, and in particular, James Meredith, who was shot and killed, he coined the phrase Black Power, and he started to encourage action rather than nonviolence. And this is where city riots begin to plague many cities in the 1960s. We see a lot of race riots occur. Even in Newark, there was one. And this is where the issue of Black Power and Stokely Carmichael coins that phrase Black Power. And of course, things are made worse when Martin Luther King is gunned down, and now the biggest advocate for nonviolence and the person that really could steer the movement in the right direction is now gone. We also see leaders like Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a civil rights leader who encourages separation. Malcolm X went to prison as a young man, and he was, convicted of robbery. He was, not a good contributor to society. But when he went to prison, he found Islam, and as a result of that, he began to become very religious. But he also became an outspoken civil rights leader. And Malcolm X encouraged separation. He felt that blacks and whites didn't have to live together, but blacks had to stand up for themselves, and that there was this movement more for separation of races by him rather than integration. So he's very opposite of Martin Luther King in a lot of ways. But then Malcolm X does what every Muslim is supposed to do. He goes to Mecca. And when he's at Mecca, he is realizing that his religion is much more inclusive than what the Islam leaders in the United States had made it appear. And he writes to his wife, when he's doing this pilgrimage to Mecca, that he dined with men whose eyes were the bluest of blue and hair was the blondest of blonde, and he realized that the religion of Islam is inclusive. Why shouldn't the United States be like this? So he returned and he began to preach a much more nonviolent and integration type of attitude. But this eventually leads to his assassination. And there are people that, it's a crime that hasn't been solved. And there's people that believe that the current leader of Islam, Reverend Farrakhan, had something to do with it. Even Malcolm X's own daughter believes that.